Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Jeffrey Geisner, founder of the Jewish Holocaust and Remembrance Group and the Obligations of Memory podcast network. I'm here today with Agnes Schippers from Sarasota, Florida, and we're going to be discussing her parents. Both were survivors of the Holocaust. Agnes is a 2G, like I am, and she has wrote a terrific book, and the book is called Sabrina's Odyssey, A Hidden Child and Her Dutch Rescuers. Let me tell you a little bit about Sabrina. Sabrina's Odyssey book is a beautiful memoir written by Agnes Schippers in honor of her mother's life during World War II and her father, a member of the Dutch resistance. In it, Agnes retells the story of her mother's struggles during her hidden years, yet this is not merely a story of struggle, but one of kindness, courage, and resistance. This memoir gives the voice to those who stayed silent for all those years. What was really interesting is my parents never spoke to me about any of their Holocaust experiences. And so unfortunately, they both passed, and I'm now left with trying to put the puzzle pieces together. And so I'm really wanting to learn from you, because your parents did speak about their Holocaust. So why don't you take us back to the pre-war days about your mother and your father, and we'll start there.
Okay. Well, my mother and father came from very different backgrounds. I think only in a war would they have met. My mother was born in January of 1927, the second child of a very wealthy, successful German lawyer, Georg Fröhlich, and his wife Edith Nissen, also from a very well-to-do and cultured family. Her father was a surgeon who built his own surgical clinic. So she had a very charmed childhood. They had family housekeeper and servants. She went to private schools. She had dance lessons. She learned to read music before she learned to read. Music lessons. She did very well in school. She was actually skipped a grade. So she was also raised, and this is a little different from probably most stories, she was raised Catholic. My grandmother converted to Catholicism. This was before the Nazi era. So she raised my mother's brother, Andreas, who was 6 years older than her, born in 1921, and Sabine as Catholics. So when she was in fourth grade, she went to a Catholic school, Ursuline school, and everything came apart after Kristallnacht. My grandfather was aware of obviously the Nazis and the restrictions they imposed. Both my German grandfather and grandmother came from Jewish families, Jewish ancestry. So they were swept into all the Nazi restrictions. Some relatives left in the early 30s for the United States, but my grandfather thought Hitler was an extremist nut and he would outlive them, but it was only in Kristallnacht when he finally acknowledged there was no future for his family in Germany.
And where in Germany were they born?
Breslau. Breslau, which has now been partitioned off to Poland and is known as Wrocław, or it's spelled Wrocław.
Okay.
So it was one of the larger, I think the seventh largest German city pre-war, and had Jewish population was maybe 10%, which was substantial in that era, but mostly Protestant and Catholic. After Kristallnacht, they sent my mother's brother first to the border, and he ultimately ended up in England at a pre-seminary school. My mother went with the Kindertransport, and she lived with an American family. And in the summer of 1939, the parents, who were unable to get US visas, decided to wait for them in the Netherlands. So
when you said that she went by Kindertransport, from where to where?
From Breslau to Bromley, England.
Okay. And so she was in
Holland.
So your mother was living with English surrogates, I would say.
Well, it was an American family living
Okay,
in
in
the
England.
States
Okay,
that took her in, and she said, welcomed her and treated her. There were 3 other girls living there, so she just became a member of the family.
gotcha.
And she said she was too young to appreciate. For her, it was just an adventure, although she got very homesick. She didn't really have an awareness, until after the war, that her parents had sent her away to save her. So they ended up, in the summer of 1939, she and her brother came to the Netherlands to stay there during the summer vacation. And on September 1st, war broke out when Germany invaded Poland. And my grandparents decided not to send the children back to England. They thought Holland was neutral in World War I. It would stay neutral. It was safer. And they are also afraid that they would be interned as enemy aliens, which happened to quite a few German refugees in England. So they were essentially had to stay in the Netherlands, as my grandfather tried repeatedly to get a US visa or try to get exit visas. He ultimately was able to get a visa to Ecuador, but he had to still get the transit visa. And in the process of all that, the roundup started. So my mother's brother was rounded up very early in the war in retaliation for a Dutch act of sabotage, sent to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, where he perished within months. And it was one of the most gruesome, brutal of the concentration camps. After that, his friends helped my mother and her parents to go into hiding separately in the Dutch countryside. And that's where my father enters the picture. He was born in 1914, the son essentially of farmers, a farming family. His father didn't want to be a dairy farmer. He switched to growing flower bulbs. He sent my father to England when he was in his early teens to learn English to help with the trade, the tulip, mainly tulips, gladiolus, hyacinths, flower bulbs. So that becomes significant. His fluency in English becomes significant for his resistance work in World War II. So he was a soldier. He did military service. He was in the military on the Utrecht front when the Germans invaded in 1940, ignoring neutrality and all that. And he was in a prisoner of war camp for about 6 weeks, and they released him because he was in agricultural trade and that was useful to the Germans, so he was released. And he became active in the resistance, mainly through his uncle, who was an active member and recruited my father. And by resistance, we mean hiding Jewish families, hiding young Dutch boys evading slave labor. He became involved in publishing an underground newspaper, finding rations for the hidden people, and then also became quite involved later in the droppings of weapons by the British and Canadian soldiers in the farm fields of North Holland in the hopes that they would help liberate the country. And you want how they met?
Yes, I do. That's a great story. So let's hear it.
Okay, so how they met was my mother, it was hidden in 9 different places. She had to be moved around for various reasons, including her safety. And she was in her 6th hiding place, working as a nanny for the family of Dr. Bosch. When a young man comes to the door, he's dressed in a trench coat and felt hat. And the doctor's wife answers, and he asks to see the ration card for Fietsje, which was she had several false names and false ID cards. The doctor's wife and my mother assumed he was a Dutch policeman sent to arrest her. So she was utterly terrified. The doctor's wife said, "I'm afraid they have found you," and told her to wait in the room next door. And she told the young man, who did not identify himself, "You'll have to wait till my husband comes home." So not a long time after, the doctor comes home and greets the man by name. Well, Mr. Schipper. It turns out he's from the Dutch resistance, sent to check on her identity card so they can obtain more rations for her. He had been sent by his uncle. So the reason my mother thought he came to arrest her is because plainclothesmen had come to their apartment to arrest her brother. They were not dressed as police, or German or Dutch police. So she, they obviously fell in love. Here I am.
Okay, that's a great story. So I see some pictures behind you.
Yes.
Can you maybe pull those on? Is those
Sure.
your mother and your father?
So these are actually mainly of, let me walk you through them. This is my grandmother. This is Edith, my mother's mother. Very beautiful young woman. This is my grandfather, German Fröhlich, who was a lawyer and a judge. This is my mother. By the way, I have hundreds of photographs and documents. This is one of the better documented.
She's
This
very
is my
big.
mother as a child.
Yeah.
And this would have been taken, it's not a very great copy because it's taken off a framed photograph, but this is in 1938, again, shortly before everything fell apart.
And
so my mother's brother, and my grandmother.
Okay, and so where did your grandparents, do you have any history and know what happened to them?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so what happened to, obviously, did they get out of Germany? I mean,
yes.
Okay.
They left Germany in July of 1939. It took a while for them to close their business, to close his law practice. They had bought boat tickets for the United States, again, hoping they could bring the whole family away. Put a lot of their possessions into storage, and went to Vals, Holland, to await what they hoped would be the visas. They hoped it would just be a temporary stay. It's interesting that Ken Burns is the documentary that's going to be shown next week focuses on the United States and the Holocaust and how very difficult they made it for people to get visas. And my grandparents, their family is an illustration of that story.
So how did
they went to the Netherlands, and they went into hiding separately. My grandmother was actually arrested during a big roundup of converted Jews on August 2nd, 1942. The same time Edith Stein, who was raised Jewish but became a Catholic nun. They rounded up, and my grandmother faked a heart attack on the tram with a German soldier. He brought her to a clinic where the doctor said this woman is dying, and left her there. And after that, she and my grandfather went into hiding. So that transport went straight to Auschwitz. So, and after they went into hiding, they came looking for my grandfather, who was a decorated World War I veteran.
So we have a few data points in common. My father was born in 1921 in Stuttgart, Germany. He, with his mother and father, he was put on a kinder transport from Hadassah at age 15 in 1936, going with 100 other teenagers through Italy on a ship then to Haifa, Palestine. My grandmother was divorced from my grandfather. My grandfather eventually in 1942 in Berlin was deported to Terezin and was murdered there. But my grandmother and my dad's younger brother, who was 4 years younger than my dad, went on a kinder transport, went on the work transport to Manchester, England. And you mentioned about detainees. My uncle Horst, was immediately detained. He was 15 when he went on that transport, and he was detained as they were concerned about the German spies.
Enemy aliens, quote.
Enemy aliens, and he was then deported to Australia, and he was in a detention camp in Australia, and eventually he came back and fought against the Germans, and he was in the Ardennes. So it's a kind of an interesting, we have kind of similar pathways. None of that I knew from my parents. That's all part of the research that I've been doing. So let's talk a little bit about how your parents finally got to the United States, because they obviously, as I know, they did get here. And so how did that all turn out?
So after they survived the war, they had to resurface, reestablish who they were. My mother's uncles had two uncles. One was Rudolf Nissen, a surgeon who operated in a number of hospitals in New York City, and Ferdinand. These were both brothers of my grandmother. They had come to the United States earlier. So they encouraged my mother and father to give the United States a try, because post-war Europe was devastated. The economy was devastated. So they came here initially just to explore it, literally within a month of their marriage in 1947. My father was given a little seed money by the uncle. He bought a car and drove across the country and took orders for flower bulbs, for bulbs from wholesale growers. So he gradually grew that business. And I was born in 48, a year after they immigrated.
And how about your grandparents?
That's an interesting story. I'm assuming you're talking about the German grandparents. The Dutch ones just stayed, in the small town where they grew up. But my grandmother did not want to go back to Germany. So she actually came to the United States with my mother and father on the boat, and stayed with her brother, and also kind of worked as a companion, and was encouraging my grandfather to come to the United States and explore possibilities. He, being a lawyer, not a very transportable profession, you're pretty limited to the country where you practice. He was approached by a nephew who came to England before the war and ended up going as an English soldier, and encouraged him to apply to the Allied government in Germany, which was helping to re-piece together a German legal system. So my grandfather went back to Germany and had a series of judgeships, starting out in Hamm, later in Münster, and ultimately ended up on the German Supreme Court, the Bundesverfassungsgericht for constitutional matters.
And this
he was a German patriot to his core.
So how was he reunited with your grandmother?
He convinced my grandmother to come back with these letters where he's literally courting her to come back. I'm lonely. And in the beginning, there was very little housing. Much of Germany had been bombed out, and food was difficult and heat was difficult. So in 48, I think, she went to live with him temporarily, and ultimately gave in. My mother, she gave in reluctantly. She didn't want to return to Germany. My mother said once her parents passed away, she would never set foot in Germany, and she didn't once they passed away. But my grandfather.
So you have a very unusual situation that you have grandparents, because I lost my paternal grandparent, my paternal grandfather. I lost my maternal grandmother in Auschwitz. My grandfather survived Auschwitz along with my mother and her two sisters. We lost her baby sister on day one when Mengele appointed her to go to the left, and her mother, my mom's mom, wouldn't let her go, and so they were both murdered by gas on day one. But I always wondered where my the story about my grandparents. I had this mixed situation with your grandparents. However, you have a unique situation where both your grandparents on your mother's side are still living, and you had grandparents on your father's side as well, right?
Correct.
Okay.
But I grew up in the United States, and my grandparents were in the Netherlands and Germany. But I did go there on I wouldn't say frequent, but I took at least 4 or 5 trips.
Okay.
So I did get to know them and spent a summer with my German grandparents.
So you, in your little book bio, you talk about memories of your mother in hiding. So what were some of those memories that you are speaking about?
Well, I understand she hid in 9 different places. So she was first put in a convent, and she remembers what her false name was at that time. And she had to pretend she was from Indonesia, and all the children would, as she had to pretend she was cold all the time. And she even learned some Indonesian, but explained that she spoke English at home and Dutch, which is, she had become fluent in Dutch with not a trace of a German accent, unlike my grandparents, who obviously learned it later and had pretty thick accents in Dutch. So she remembers working with the children who lived at this convent. And then her father thought he finally had the visas together, so she had to resurface, with her old JID card. When I say J, I mean if you were Jewish, there was a big J. I actually have a copy of that. I don't have a copy, I have the original ID card. And of course, it all fell apart. He thought in 42 he had finally managed to get exit visas. He was he's hoping to get to Ecuador. So she had to resurface, and that was a horrible, horrible time where they lived in total terror of every knock on the door. They couldn't go to theaters, libraries, most stores. The Nazis pretty well segregated and isolated.
But they were living with other people who were supporting their ability to eat.
They were living in, at this point, they were still above ground. They lived in a pension, which is like a mini boarding hotel that was owned by a niece. And my grandfather had lent money to that niece to buy the pension with the stipulation that if his family ever needed housing, she would provide that. So she did provide a small room for my mother, her parents, and another room for my mother's brother in this pension. And by the way, we just had Stolpersteins placed in front of the apartment where they lived before they had to go underground.
So let me ask you, I wanted to ask you, is your husband a second generation as well, or not?
No.
And he was born in the United States, or was he born elsewhere?
The first husband, both my husbands were born in the United States, but my first husband was born. They both were. So no.
Okay.
No stories on that side.
Okay. So any other stories? We're going close to the end.
I could take up the next
well, we're
4 hours.
gonna hear more, but I just want to hear a little bit more in that vein.
For 3 months, she was hidden in the attic in Amsterdam of her favorite teacher, Agnes Nolte. I'm named after her. And she does remember the searchlights looking for Allied planes. And after that, she went into the countryside and had a mixed experience. In the first farm, she was treated like slave labor and physically and sexually abused. She was removed from there and went to a series of other homes where she worked pretty hard.
Was there a stimulus that required her to move? I mean, was she being found out, or she left Amsterdam because it was becoming very, very unsafe, as the experience of the Frank family showed. It just wasn't safe. It was safer out in the countryside. So my mother's brother his friends made contact with the resistance in North Holland. So we're talking north of Amsterdam, the countryside. So she was sent out to the countryside for her safety. The first place turned out to be a horrible. Because she was fluent in Dutch, she was able to talk to the neighbors because she was treated like she was just a servant girl imported. And she believes they contacted a priest who helped
get her out of that situation to another couple. Only stayed there for a few weeks, and then she was moved to a stonemason's house that was close to where her parents were being hidden. So she hadn't seen them before.
And how old is she at this time? And all these
So
moves?
she first went into hiding in 42, so she would have been 15. So she went to a series of hiding places, including what I mentioned earlier. The doctor, who was frequently called because she had a series of illnesses, decided she might be better off just working for his family.
Mhm.
And then after my father's uncle, Schipper, his namesake, was arrested by the Dutch Nazis for his underground activities, he had to move all the families under that uncle's protection. So my mother was moved to different places after that, some of which were not safe because they had a lot of children who talked about their interesting visitor. Her second to last place, she said, was her happiest place because they treated her like a member of the family, not some servant girl, and very, very kind to her. And then the last place, this is number 9, she was reunited with her parents, who were hiding with the mayor of Bovenkaspel, a little town in North Holland. She'd gone there just to visit, but had a high fever. So they asked if she could just stay till she got better, and she ended up spending the last months of the war.
And what was the earliest recollection that you remember your mother talking to you about these stories?
Oh, that's another story. I didn't find out that. I knew my mother had been hidden and that my father was in the Dutch resistance, but I was told it was because my grandfather had spoken out against the Nazis. And there is some truth to that. I had no idea. It wasn't until I was 20 that an elderly aunt that I visited when I studied abroad in England asked me if I knew about Andreas, that's my mother's brother. And I said I did. I knew he had been taken to and died in a concentration camp. And she said they took him because he was Jewish. I had no idea. I mean, when you grow apart, an ocean apart from all your relatives, you can keep those kind of secrets.
So let me kind of stop you here just to clear up something.
Sure.
So when your parents came to the United States
Right.
and you were born,
Right.
they took up being Jewish, or they kept on being Catholic?
I was raised Catholic.
You were raised Catholic. Okay.
I was raised Catholic, the faith of my father and the faith my mother had been raised in.
Okay.
So I had no idea that I had Jewish heritage. I discovered that at age 20 and then confronted my mother when I returned to the United States.
And how old was your mother at the time when you were 20?
She is 21 years older than me, so she would have been 41. And I confronted her. I said, why didn't you tell me about this? And she said her mother made her promise never to tell because she didn't want the curse of the heritage to follow another generation. My grandmother was understandably traumatized by the loss of her only son. Mm-hmm. They were, quote, assimilated. They were not practicing Jews. My grandfather's father was, but that was the last practicing Jew.
Were you religious Catholics?
I was raised, I went to Catholic and parochial school.
Wow, this is actually a great place to keep everyone on pins and needles. We're finishing up our first episode of the Obligations of Memory podcast. I'm Jeffrey Geisner, founder of the Jewish Holocaust and Remembrance Group. I'm here with Agnes Schipper, who has written a terrific book, Sabine's Odyssey, A Hidden Child and Her Dutch Rescuers. We're going to be right back and learn much more about this book and about what I call the fun part of the interview process is learning more about how you learned about the Holocaust. We'll be right back.